Twins, a story told by a death row inmate to his chaplain. Edogawa Rampo. Sir, I have decided to speak today. The day of my execution is drawing near. I would like to speak my mind quickly so that I can spend at least the last few days of my life in peace. I know this may be a bother, but please spare a little time for this poor death row inmate. As you know, sir, I was sentenced to death for killing a man and stealing 30,000 yen from his safe. No one suspects me more than that. I have in fact committed that crime, and now that I have been sentenced to death, there is no need for me to confess to another, more serious crime. Even if that crime were many times more serious than the known one, there is no way I could inflict a more severe punishment on someone who has already been sentenced to death. No, it's not just that it's unnecessary. There is something akin to vanity that makes me want to minimize my notoriety as much as possible, even as I die. And there is another reason why I do not want my wife to know about this, no matter what. I have suffered so much unnecessary hardship because of this. I knew that even if I had kept that fact a secret, I would still be sentenced to death. But despite the court's strict scrutiny, I suppressed the words that were about to come out and did not confess. However, I now wish for you to explain it in detail to my wife in your own words. No matter how evil a person is, they may become good as their death approaches. I would feel so sorry for my wife if I died without confessing to this other crime. And another reason is that I am terrified of the obsession of the man I killed. No, I am not talking about the man I killed while stealing money. I've already confessed to that murder, so it doesn't bother me much. But before that, I had committed another murder, and I can't bear to think about that man. It was my older brother. But no ordinary older brother. I was born one of two twins, so although the man I killed was my older brother in name, he was also my twin, born at the same time as me from my mother's womb. He comes to torment me day and night. In my dreams, he weighs 1,000 pounds on my chest and strangles me. In the daytime, he appears on that wall and glares at me with an indescribable look in his eyes, or he sticks his head out that window and showers me with a nasty sneer. And what's even worse is that, as my twin, he was exactly like me, in face and shape. He began appearing before me even before I came here, that is, the day after I killed him. Come to think of it, it's possible that his obsession was the reason I committed my second murder, and that the murder I had planned so hard was discovered. The day after I killed him, I began to fear mirrors. And not just mirrors. I became afraid of anything that reflected an image. I have removed all mirrors and other glass from my house, but it has not helped. In the city, there are shop windows lined from eaves to eaves, and mirrors shine behind them. The more I try not to look, the more my eye is drawn to them. And in those glass and mirrors, the man I killed, which is actually my own shadow, glares at me with a malicious look. Once I nearly fainted in front of a mirror shop. There, countless identical men, the men I had killed, had 1,000 eyes fixed on me. But even though I was troubled by such visions, I never gave up. My overly conceited confidence, wondering how something I had thought so thoroughly through with such a clear head would ever be discovered, made me bold. And as I continued to commit sin after sin, I was so busy that I couldn't let my guard down for even a second, leaving me no room to think about anything else. But once I've become a sinner like this, it's all over. His ghost took advantage of this monotonous prison life, with nothing to distract you, and took possession of my mind. This was especially true after I was sentenced to death. There are no mirrors here, but when I washed or bathed, he would appear as my own shadow in the water. Even the miso soup at mealtimes brings his haggard face to mind. Otherwise, his figure would appear, big or small, on the surface of tableware, the shiny surface of metal fittings in the room, or anywhere else the shadow of an object was cast. I even felt frightened by my own shadow, illuminated by the faint sunlight filtering in through the window. And in the end, what a disaster. I began to fear looking at my own body. I began to fear my own body, which was exactly like the dead man's, down to the shape of every wrinkle. I would rather die than continue the suffering. I have no fear of the death penalty. In fact, I hope that the day of my execution will come as soon as possible. However, I am worried about dying in silence. I must get his permission before I die. Rather, I wish to eliminate the anxiety in my heart that makes me fear his visions. There is only one way to do this, to confess my crime to my wife. At the same time, I must make the world aware of it. Sir, please listen to my confession and convey it to the judges. And although it may be a bold request, could you please promise to tell my wife about it as well? Thank you very much. You have agreed. So I would now like to tell you about this other crime I am guilty of. As I mentioned before, I was born as one of a very rare set of twins. Aside from a single mole on my thigh, which was the only way our parents could tell us apart, we were identical from head to toe, as if we had been made from the same mold. If you were to count the hairs on our heads, there would probably not be a single difference, even though there were tens of thousands, hundreds, or even hundreds of them. Being born as such similar twins was my fundamental motivation for committing a great sin. One day I decided to kill my twin brother. That said, it's not that I held any particular grudge against him. Of course, I was very resentful that, while my brother had inherited a vast fortune as the family heir, my share was incomparably smaller, and that the woman who had once been my lover had been forced by our parents to become my brother's wife simply because my brother was wealthier and had more status. However, these were not my brother's faults, but the faults of my parents who had given my brother such a position. If I was to feel resentment, I should have blamed my late parents, and it seemed my brother had no idea that his wife had previously been my lover. So if I had just lived an easy life, nothing would have happened. But the bad thing was that I was a naturally evil man, and I was terrible at getting along in the world like most people. And what was even worse was that I had no goals in life. All I wanted to do was live each day happily and enjoyably. I had become a kind of scoundrel with no sense of purpose in thinking about tomorrow when I had no idea whether I would be alive or dead. But having gained neither the fortune nor the love that I now call my fortune, I had become desperate. And so in a flash, I lost the money that I had been given as my share. So I had no choice but to go to my brother's house to ask for money, and I caused him a lot of trouble. However, as this happened repeatedly, my brother grew fed up with my endless requests and gradually began to refuse to listen to my requests. In the end, he even turned me away, saying that no matter how much I begged him, he would never help me until I got my affairs in order. One day after being turned down again, I was on my way home from my brother's house when a terrifying thought suddenly occurred to me. When the thought first crossed my mind, I couldn't help but shudder, and so I tried to shake off this terrifying delusion. However, as I thought about it more and more, I realized that it wasn't necessarily a delusion. I began to think that if I carried it out with great determination and scrupulous care, perhaps I could obtain wealth and love without the slightest risk. For several days I thought about it alone. After considering all the possible options, I finally made up my mind to carry out my terrifying plan. It was in no way because I held any grudge against my brother. I was born a villain, and I simply wanted to obtain my own pleasure, no matter the cost. However, as a villain and an extreme coward, I would never have made such a decision if I had foreseen even the slightest danger, but the plan I had devised contained no danger whatsoever, or so I believed. So at last I set about carrying it out. First, as a preliminary step, I made frequent but unobtrusive visits to my brother's house. I also studied in detail the everyday activities of my brother and his wife. I didn't overlook even the smallest detail and even noted things like, for example, whether my brother twisted a handkerchief to the right or left when wringing it out. After more than a month of complete research, I came up with an excuse that would not arouse any suspicion and told my brother I was going to Korea to work. I should point out that I had remained single up until that point, and so this plan did not seem unnatural in the least. My brother was very pleased with my earnest intentions, and if you were to speculate, he might have been happy to get rid of me, but whatever the case, he gave me a handsome farewell gift. One day, a day that in every respect suited my plans perfectly, my brother and his wife saw me off as I boarded a train heading south from Tokyo Station. When the train arrived at Yamakita Station, I was supposed to continue on to Shimonoseki, but instead I got off unobtrusively, waited a bit, and then slipped into the third-class compartment of an upbound train to head back to Tokyo. While waiting for the train at Yamakita Station, I used the toilet there, and with the tip of a knife gouged out the mole on my thigh, the only thing that distinguished me from my brother. Now my brother and I were exactly the same person. After all, it was not impossible that my brother would inflict a cut in the exact place where the mole was. We arrived at Tokyo Station just as dawn was breaking. This, too, was something I had planned in advance to happen at that exact moment. I put on the same Oshima kimono that my brother wore every day at the time, which I had prepared before leaving. And of course, I had the same underwear, OB and Geta sandals as my brother, and waited for the right time to go to my brother's house. Then, being careful not to be seen, I climbed over the wooden fence at the back and sneaked into my brother's spacious garden. It was still dim in the early morning hours, so I was able to make my way to an old well in the corner of the garden without worrying about being spotted by the family. This old well was one of the major factors that led me to decide to commit a crime. It had long since dried up and become abandoned, and my brother had decided to fill it in soon, saying that it was dangerous to have such a pitfall in the garden. A small mound of soil had even been prepared next to the well, so the gardener was ready to start work whenever he had time. A few days ago, I went to the gardener and ordered him to start work that morning, the day I had sneaked in. I crouched down and hid in the bushes and waited. Every morning after washing, my brother would stroll around the garden, taking deep breaths, and I was waiting, eager to see him approach. I was completely engrossed. My body was trembling constantly, as if I had malaria. I could feel something cold trickling from under my armpit, running down my arm. That unbearable moment must have felt so long. After what felt like 3 hours of waiting, I finally heard the sound of Geta sandals from in the distance. I don't know how many times I wanted to run away before the source of that sound appeared before me. But what little sanity I had left finally held me in place. Soon my long-awaited victim arrived right in front of the bushes where I was hiding. I suddenly jumped out and wrapped the thin rope I had prepared around my brother's neck. My twin, who looked exactly like me, from behind and strangled him with all my might. Even as he was being squeezed, my brother tried to twist his head back, trying to determine the identity of his attacker. I tried with all my strength to stop him, but his dying neck continued to twist towards me, like an extremely strong clockwork. Finally, his red, swollen neck, which was not at all different from my own, turned halfway towards me, and out of the corner of his rolled-up eyes he spotted me, and for a moment a look of shock crossed his face. I will never forget the look on his face, even if I die, but soon he stopped struggling and collapsed. It took a lot of effort for me to straighten my arms, which had become stiff and nerveless when I strangled him. Then with shaky feet, I rolled my brother's body, which was lying there, to the old well nearby and pushed it to the bottom. I then picked up a piece of wood that I found nearby and scraped the dirt that had been piled up nearby into the well until my brother's body was hidden. It must have been a truly bizarre sight, like witnessing a nightmare in broad daylight. Had any bystanders been present? One man strangled to death another man who was wearing the same clothes, had the same physique, and even had the same face, without saying a word from start to finish. So that's it, and thus I committed the grave sin of murdering my brother. You're probably amazed that I could kill my only brother without any remorse. You're right. But if you ask me, it was precisely because he was my brother that I felt the urge to kill him. I don't know if you've ever experienced this, but humans have a feeling called hatred for their own kind. This feeling is often written about in novels and other books, so I'm not alone in feeling it. But it is a type of hatred far more unbearable than any hatred felt toward a stranger. And when it's a twin like me, with identical faces, it's absolutely unbearable. Even if there's no other reason, the fact that we're blood relatives and we share the same face is enough to make me want to kill him. I think one of the reasons why a coward like me was able to kill my brother so calmly is because of this hatred. Well, I continued to crouch where I was, even after I had covered the body with enough soil. I waited like this for 30 minutes when the maid ushered the gardener in. I turned around for my first appearance as an older brother, feeling a bit nervous. Then trying to sound as natural as possible. "Oh, gardener, you're early. I was just about to help you guys out a bit." "Haha, it should be filled in today, right? Well then, I'll be counting on you." And with that, I slowly stood up and walked to my brother's room at his pace. Everything went smoothly from then on. That whole day, I holed myself up in my brother's study, intently studying his diary and ledger. Of all the research I had done before announcing my intention to go to Korea, these were the only two that remained. That night, I had a pleasant chat with my wife, the woman who had been my brother's wife until yesterday and is now my wife. Just like my brother would normally, without the slightest worry of being discovered. Then late that night, I even boldly entered my wife's bedroom. However, I felt a little unsafe doing so. The only thing I knew nothing about was my brother's habits in the bedroom. But I was certain of one thing. I was conceited and thought that even if she were to find out the truth, she would never consider me, her former lover, a guilty party. So I casually opened the sliding screen door to my wife's bedroom. And how fortunate was I that she had no idea. And so I ended up committing adultery. For the next year, I lived the happiest life in the world. Money to spend, the woman I had once loved, and my greedy desires never seemed to be lacking during that year. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, I was constantly haunted by the ghost of my brother. But a year was the limit for someone like me who easily gets bored of things. It was around that time that I began to tire of my wife. My old habits resurfaced, and I began to play around. This won't do. That won't do. I keep thinking up all sorts of ways to waste money, spending it like water. Any assets I had were gone in a flash, and my debts grew rapidly. And when I simply could no longer find a source of funds, alas, I began to commit a second sin. This second sin was one that naturally arose from the first. I had already been thinking about this when I decided to kill my brother. I thought that if I could completely become my brother, then no matter what great sins I had committed in the past, it would have no effect on me now, as the brother I was. In other words, if I, the younger brother, who hadn't been heard from since he left for Korea, were to return to the mainland and commit murder or robbery, it would be my crime as the younger brother. And as long as I wasn't caught, there would be no danger to me as the older brother. However, sometime after I committed my first crime, I made a startling discovery. And with that discovery, the possibility of a second crime became even clearer. One day, carefully imitating my brother's handwriting, I was writing my day's diary as an older brother in his diary. This was one of the tedious daily routines that I, as an older brother, had to do. As I finished writing in my diary, as I always did, I would compare my entries here and there with those my real brother had written. Then suddenly I noticed something astonishing. There, in the corner of the page where my true brother had made his mark, was a fingerprint that clearly appeared. I was startled to realize how incredibly careless I had been. I had been gravely mistaken in believing that the only difference between me and my brother was the mole on my crotch. I had heard that everyone's fingerprints are unique, and that even twins' fingerprints will never be the same. So when I discovered what was undoubtedly my brother's fingerprint in the diary, I turned pale with worry that my true colors might be revealing themselves. I quietly bought a magnifying glass and meticulously compared the fingerprint in the diary with my own fingerprint pressed onto another piece of paper. The fingerprint and the fingerprint from a certain finger of mine were so similar that they were indistinguishable at first glance. However, when I traced each line individually, they were clearly different. The strange thing was that while the overall feel was almost the same, the parts were completely different. Just to be sure, I discreetly took the fingerprints of my wife and the maid's, but there was no need to compare them. They were not the least bit similar. So I had no choice but to assume that these were my brother's fingerprints. It's not surprising that they were similar to mine. We were identical twins. But the one thing that differed, even slightly, was our fingerprints. I was worried that it would be a disaster if many more like this remained. So I did everything I could to find it. I looked through every page of my many books, searched through the dusty corners of closets and cupboards, and looked in every possible place where fingerprints might remain. But I couldn't find a single one outside of the pages of the diary. Feeling a bit relieved, I decided that once I'd turned this diary page to ashes, I wouldn't have to worry anymore. So I was about to tear it out and throw it into the brazier. And then, suddenly, as if by inspiration, though not from God, perhaps from the devil, a brilliant idea came to me. What if I made a mold of my fingerprints, and if I were to commit a second crime someday, I used that mold to leave my fingerprints at the crime scene? The devil whispered this in my ear. For example, to take an extreme case, let's say I were to kill someone. In that case, I would first imagine myself as a younger brother who had been in Korea and returned to the mainland. And I would pretend, both mentally and dressed, to be a dissolute younger brother. Meanwhile, I would prepare an alibi for myself as an older brother. Then I would commit the murder. Of course, I would be careful not to leave any evidence at the scene. This alone might be enough. However, it would be dangerous if suspicion were to fall on me as an older brother for some reason. Even if I had an alibi prepared, how could I guarantee that it wouldn't be revealed? In that case, what if my real brother's fingerprints were found at the crime scene? No one would remember my fingerprints from when I was his younger brother, so there was no way they would know whose fingerprints they belonged to. Even if someone witnessed my crime, the difference in my fingerprints would simply exonerate me. The police would have to forever search for the man with the fingerprints of someone already dead, and for me as his brother, who could no longer be in this world. I was ecstatic about this brilliant idea. It was as if I could actually bring Stevenson's fantastical novel, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, to life. As a villain, I had probably never felt happier in my life than when I came up with this scheme. However, when I came up with this idea, I was still immersed in my happy life and had no intention of plotting anything evil. It wasn't until I started playing around and found myself struggling with debt that I actually tried it out. One day I used this method to steal a small sum of money from a friend's house. Creating fingerprints for rubber stamps wasn't particularly difficult for me, since I had experience in plate making. From then on, I used this method whenever I was short on money for fun, and never once did I arouse even the slightest suspicion. In some cases, the victim simply gave up and didn't report it to the police. Even when it did become a police matter, it was swept under the rug before fingerprints could be found. As a result, I succeeded in my thefts with such ease. I got carried away, and in the end, I ended up committing murder. Regarding this final crime of mine, since records likely exist, I shall state it very briefly. When I was, as usual, pressed for a substantial sum of money due to mounting debts, an acquaintance told me in person, right in front of his safe, that he needed to keep a large sum, 30,000 yen, in his home safe overnight for some reason. It was supposedly for some secret political campaign fund or something like that. Even though I was in debt, I had full confidence in that person. There were a few other guests in the room, including the wife of the family and myself. After thoroughly investigating all the circumstances, I disguised myself as my friend's younger brother and sneaked into my friend's house that night. Of course, I had already prepared an alibi for myself as the twin brother. I managed to sneak easily to the room where the safe was. Since he was a longtime friend, guessing the safe combination was extremely easy. Then with gloved hands, he opened the safe door and pulled out bundles of cash. At that moment, the lights in the room, which had been off until then, suddenly came on. Surprised, I turned around to find the safe's owner standing there, glaring at me. Knowing that this was all over, I quickly drew the knife from my pocket and lunged at my friend's chest. It all happened in an instant. He was already dead before me. I listened intently. Thankfully, no one woke up. Or perhaps they knew, but were too scared to move. I quickly dipped the rubber fingerprint I'd made in the blood that was there and pressed it firmly against the wall nearby. After making sure that no other evidence was left behind, I hurriedly fled, being careful not to leave any footprints. The next day, I received a visit from a detective, but I was confident enough that it wasn't a bit surprising. The detective explained, in a tone that seemed genuinely apologetic, that he had visited each person who might have known about the large sum of money in the murdered friend's safe. He also explained that a single fingerprint had been found at the scene, and that no match had been found among the fingerprints of known criminals. Then he addressed me as well, asking me, as a friend of the deceased and someone who knew about the large sum in the safe, if he could take my fingerprints. Laughing to myself, I asked him questions in a tone that seemed to express my sorrow over my friend's death, and had my fingerprints taken. The police are probably frantically searching right now for the owner of those fingerprints that would likely never be found, even if it took them a lifetime. With this unexpected sum of money in my pocket, I didn't think much of it and immediately ordered my car and headed out to my usual hangout spot. A few days later, the same detective came to me again. I later learned that the detective was a renowned detective even within the Metropolitan Police Department. I casually walked into the reception room, but when I saw a hint of a smile in the detective's eyes as he stood there, a growl, almost a scream, rose from my throat. The detective seemed very calm and placed a piece of paper on the table. In my rage, I didn't really understand it at the time, but when I thought about it later, I realized it was my arrest warrant. While I glanced at the piece of paper for a moment, the detective quickly came over to me and put a rope around both my hands. I looked and saw a burly police officer waiting outside the entrance. There was nothing I could do, and so I was finally imprisoned. But even while I was incarcerated, my foolish self still felt at ease. I was convinced that there was no way that any evidence could prove that I had committed murder. But you know what? When I was brought before the investigating judge and told of my crimes, I was so shocked that I couldn't close my mouth. It was such a comical mistake that I, the perpetrator, couldn't help but laugh in a strange way. It was undoubtedly an extremely careless mistake on my part. But who could have made me do so? I believe that this is the terrible curse of my brother. He watched in silence until what began as a small misunderstanding led to the terrifying result of being found guilty of murder. Even so, it was a truly ridiculously simple and careless mistake. The fingerprints I had believed to be my brother's were in fact my own. However, the fingerprint that was pressed on the diary page was not a normal fingerprint. It had been made after a finger that had been stained with ink had been wiped with something. In other words, it was a trace of ink that had remained between the ridges of the fingerprint. In photographic terms, the negative was what was captured. I just couldn't accept my own foolish mistake as the truth. But when I listened carefully, I realized that my mistake was not at all unreasonable. During the interrogation, the examining judge told me this without any questions. Apparently, it was in 1913 in Fukuoka, where the wife of a German officer who was being held as a prisoner of war at the time was brutally murdered. After arresting a man suspected of being the culprit, The fingerprints found at the scene and those of the perpetrator were similar, but they just couldn't be considered the same. The police had a lot of trouble, and after requesting the help of a medical doctor, they were finally able to determine that the fingerprints were the same. Just like in my case, the fingerprints found at the scene were negative. As a result of his research, the doctor took enlarged photographs of the two fingerprints and, as an experiment, made the black lines in one of the fingerprints white and the white lines black, and found that it matched the other fingerprint exactly. And now I've said everything I wanted to say. I'm sorry for taking up so much of your time on something so uninteresting. Please, as you promised earlier, convey this to the judges and my wife. I can ascend the scaffold with peace of mind, trusting that you will fulfill your promise. So please grant this poor death row inmate's dying request.
This is the end of the story. Was the woman who became the protagonist's wife unaware of his true identity? Or was she aware but worried that confronting him would ruin her life, so she said nothing? These are the questions that personally arise in my mind. At the very least, there was a major change in the way her husband spent his money, so it's possible that she had a vague idea of the truth. It wasn't easy for a woman to survive on her own in Japan 100 years ago, so she may have decided it would be better not to know what her real husband was like. Thank you for watching. See you next month.